Good day and welcome everybody to FSMA Fridays. My name is Jennifer Kenyon and I'll be your host for today's session. Today we're hosting an all Q&A session on FSMA. But first I'd like to welcome everybody back and say for those of you who might be joining us for the first time, we're happy to have you here. If you're new to this webcast, our focus is to touch on recent changes, activities, and related news about the FDA and FSMA, and to discuss industry trends that we've seen as FSMA has taken shape. It's also an opportunity to hear, learn from, and ask questions of the leaders in this industry with the Acheson Group. The folks from TAG co-sponsor these sessions and have been great supporters in the industry and great partners to work with, not just with our clients, but in providing this as a service to the food industry community. And on the software side is where we do our part. At Safety Chain, we have a food quality management system for food safety, quality assurance, and supplier compliance. Before we dig into this month's session, we have just a few housekeeping tips regarding today's webcast. We try to keep these sessions informal. These are part education, part conversation, and we hope you enjoy that format. All of our FSMA Friday sessions tend to generate lots of audience questions, and this month's session is special because it's all about addressing the FSMA questions and concerns that you find most challenging. We'll try to answer as many questions as we can during the session, but if we come up against time constraints, we're happy to follow up with you afterwards. So feel free to submit your questions using the GoToWebinar Q&A panel, and we'll monitor those behind the scenes and get to as many as we can. In the interest of everyone's privacy, only panelists are displayed and attendees are on mute. We are recording this session and we'll be sharing the recording along with a slide deck afterwards. The last detail before we get started is that we're on a webinar tool and sometimes technology doesn't cooperate as we hope it will. So if you do have any audio issues, we'll do our best to help you behind the scenes. Usually the best way to solve any audio or connection problems is either changing your audio source, so you can either use your computer or call in on the phone, or just exit the session and rejoin. That usually solves the problem. We'll touch real quickly on a few FSMA updates and then dive right into this month's focus, which is getting your most pressing FSMA questions answered. Today, we're joined by David Acheson, President and CEO of the Acheson Group. Dr. Acheson is widely known in the industry and has joined us for FSMA Fridays many times in the past. He brings over 30 years of industry experience across the entire food and import safety sector, helping clients enter new markets, enhance the value of their products, and navigate dynamic scientific and regulatory systems. Welcome back, Dr. Acheson. It's good to have you back on FSMA Fridays.
Thank you, Jennifer. Good to be back, and thank you to everybody who's joined us today.
To kick things off, let's touch on the latest FSMA news. Dr. Acheson, I understand you have a few FSMA updates to share.
Yes, just a little bit. In some regards, it's quiet on updates from FDA, but in other regards, FDA is pretty active in FSMA, which has been the source of some of the questions that we've received. So look forward to diving into those. Main update is on the Intentional Adulteration Rule, where the FDA has announced that they were going to be putting out a series of 3 guidance documents to help people navigate through that. And we've got number 1 out, which is pretty extensive and pretty lengthy. And if you are needing to comply with the Food Defense Rule, the Intentional Adulteration Rule, it's worth a read. It's got some helpful guidance in it in terms of getting started. No word that I'm aware of yet on when the other 2 guidance documents will emerge, but we're hearing shortly, whatever that may mean. But that's really the major update, is we're starting to see some information from FDA on the Intentional Adulteration Rule, which is helpful. Back to you, Jennifer.
Great. Thanks for that update. Let's move on to today's focus, which is getting your most pressing FSMA questions answered. We do have some pre-submitted questions from our audience, and I'd like to start with this one. The next big rule to hit is the Intentional Adulteration Rule in July of 2019. What do you see the industry doing to prepare for that?
Yeah, well, that's apropos to the recently published first guidance document, first in the series of 3. Yeah, indeed, this is the next and frankly the final big rule out of the big 7 that we've been tracking over the last couple of years. Intentional Adulteration Rule is probably, in some ways, is to me is the simplest, and yet in others is the most complex. And I say that, and that's not really kind of trying to talk out of both sides of my mouth. Mm-hmm. It's the simplest because inherently it's really focused on industry looking at their processes and making determinations around intentional adulteration, and with regard to really mass casualty. That's not quite the language that the FDA use. It's widespread harm. This rule is not about tampering. It's not about economically motivated. The latter is covered under the preventive control rules, as we've talked about in the past. This one is really focused on terrorism and opportunities, and the guidance document is nicely laying out some of the thought process about where in my plant could somebody do that. There's lots and lots of places where they could attack the food supply, but it's important to look at it through this lens of widespread public harm, which really means a single event in your facility. So somebody does one thing in one place that would contaminate a lot of servings. That's where industry is struggling a little bit. Some of the companies we've worked with are going overboard and say, well, we've got 200 places in our plant where something could happen. We need to put up cages and doors and locks, and that starts to get really expensive. And I don't think that's FDA's intent. So I think right now companies are struggling a little bit with what to do. How should we approach it? As the question said, it's July next year. So we basically have 12 months to figure this out. And an unashamed ad from me is that we in TAG have spent a lot of time thinking about this, and we developed tools to help people be compliant with the Food Defense Rule, the Intentional Adulteration Rule. So if you've got questions or you just want to brainstorm a little bit with some of our experts, then do reach out, because this is kind of the next big hurdle for food companies. But last point, Jennifer, quick reminder is this rule only applies to registered firms, but it applies globally. So if you are a registered firm anywhere in the world submitting food for interstate commerce, the rule applies if your sales are over $10 million. So there is a fairly high dollar amount. So the small guys less than 10 million in annual sales are off the hook on this one, but everybody else anywhere in the world, it's got global application. So anyway, back to you, Jennifer.
Sure, thank you. Next question submitted by an attendee. What should food companies be doing now that most of the compliance deadlines are passed?
Yeah, this is another very good question. And I was talking to somebody literally this week about this topic. And the fear that I think those who are kind of on the hook for compliance, the PCQIs, the Preventive Control Qualified Individuals in plants, are saying, all right, now what? We've written our food safety plan. We feel good about it. We've got people who are trained. We're ready to go. FDA hasn't showed up yet, and if they haven't, sit tight, they will. But the it's like, well, what do we do? And starting to hear a little bit of anxiety from those who are, quote, on the hook at the plant level, saying, well, corporate feel this is done. We've checked the box. We've got our food safety plan written. We're good to go. It's been perhaps looked at by a third party. Everything's green, and we're on a good track. My main point to this question is don't relax. FSMA was built, and I'm going back here historically to, 2007, 8, 9. So I'm going back almost a decade. Hate to age myself, but that's the reality. When I had the privilege of being involved in, what was FSMA all about? And figuring out where do we want to go with this whole new regulatory strategy focused on prevention. And the key principle of this, which is really the answer to the question, is number one, assess your risk and build up programs to control that risk. That's the first point. That's what we've done. That's what compliance was about. assess the risk, and develop the preventive control programs. The rubber hits the road when it is show me being FDA, that you are following your programs. It's the monitoring, it's the ongoing verification, it's the corrective actions, it's reanalyzing, it's updating those programs. That's where we start to get the bang for the buck for FSMA. It isn't just assessing the risks and putting the controls in place, it's actually doing it. And that's where some companies are starting to say, we've written the programs, we're fine. No, that's just the start. And moving from creation of your plan to maintenance and execution of your plan is going to be the next big hurdle. That's going to require continued focus, continued updates. Frankly, it prolongs FSMA Fridays too, because I think these are going to be opportunities to share learnings amongst those who join us on FSMA Fridays in terms of, what are we seeing? Where's the focus? But the key point on this one, Jennifer, is the build is over. The compliance is done. What's going to catch people out is failure to have current validation studies, to have up-to-date verification data, monitoring data, corrective action data, that your approved supplier list for subpart G of the human rule, or if you're under foreign supplier verification program, that your current supplier list isn't current, it isn't updated. That's where we're going to run into trouble. And having CFOs in companies recognize that this needs to be continually funded. It isn't just build a program and walk away. So bit of a long-winded sort of answer, but it's sort of really focused on what was this rule all about. And it wasn't about the build. That was essential. It is about the follow-through, and that's kind of where we are now with pretty much everything that's out there, obviously except the Intentional Adulteration Rule that we just talked about. So that's my thinking on that one, Jennifer.
Thanks. Next question. What are we seeing from regulators in the way of enforcement for FSMA?
Well, I'd love to get some feedback from the people on the call about what are you seeing? From our lens, from our clients, and what we're seeing is it's a bit of a mixed bag. The FDA started out, and I think stuck with this strategy of we will educate and then we will regulate. So I think we were like 95% education, maybe 5% regulation a year ago. That definitely is shifting. We're starting to see we're going to regulate, and we might throw in a bit of education, and we are rapidly moving towards you should know what to do by now. We're full bore regulation. Seems very variable from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Some companies I've worked with, big ones, have had, I'm talking here multi-billion-dollar companies, have yet to see FDA show up and do a FSMA inspection. Others, little guys, have had like 3. I'm not seeing consistency in the systems. I'm certainly seeing inspectors coming into plants who have been, quote, FSMA educated by the FDA. So they do have some knowledge. I think we continue to run the risk that the inspectors may be using some fairly heavy sticks. I've certainly seen 483s come out that are FSMA related. One case in point was around foreign supply verification program, and actually this was last December, so we're going back 6 months, where an inspector came into an importer and asked to see the foreign supply verification program, and got an unfortunate answer, which was, well, what's a foreign supply verification program, which is clearly was not a good response. And they promptly got a 483. It was like a one-liner, the single observation, you don't have a foreign supply verification program, fix it, which they immediately did. But they are starting to look very high level at things just like the example I've just given, or they're diving sometimes into the weeds. We're getting a bit of word on the street here around validation. Looking at validation studies, which is, of course, is often the nightmare for food companies, because lots of different types of equipment. They're expensive to do. They're complicated. So I think we need to continue to sort of share learnings amongst all of us in the private sector about what are we seeing. But that's at a high level, Jennifer. That's sort of where I'm seeing it. But it's moving.
Do you think you had mentioned initially it was more like 95% education, 5% regulation? What do you think that split is now? Is it?
I think it's
regulation?
Yeah, I mean, at best it's 25% education, and is what I'm seeing. But you know, that's not based on a statistical survey. That's just gut instinct.
Okay. Another question submitted: what is FDA focused on currently from a regulatory perspective?
Yeah, obviously the last question was somewhat focused on where are we seeing FSMA. I think if we broaden it out a little bit, and there's been some interesting blogging over the last few weeks about what's going on this year in food, and it's been a bit of I don't know how you describe it and what the right word is, a bumper crop of food safety issues. I'm not sure. It's like. But 2018 seems to have been the year of some fairly complicated, ongoing, in the public eye, reputationally damaging outbreaks and situations going on, the likes of which we haven't seen for a while. And I think from a regulatory perspective, FDA has got very focused on putting out fires. We were in a phase several years ago where FDA could focus on building programs and writing FSMA, and during that time, we really didn't have any large, ugly, complex, ongoing outbreaks. But recently we have. Obviously, I think probably everybody in this call is very familiar with the romaine issue that originally popped up at the beginning of the year in Canada and a little bit in the U.S., and then sort of just more recently has been very, very U.S.-centric, and long lag time between the first cases at the end of March and the final announcement several months later that the FDA had tracked it back to potentially contaminated canal water. Now, that's not FSMA, Jennifer. That's just where are they going. So they are looking at putting out fires is where they are. Now, the interesting thing for me on this is that they are leveraging more and more and more their lab testing and genetic capabilities. This is something that we've talked about previously on FSMA Fridays, is leveraging genetic technology and where to go with that and how they're doing it. So right now they're focused on that. I think pulling out my crystal ball here for FDA, and those of you who read the newsletters that we write out of TAG will have seen some of the thoughts I've had on this around product tracking. Just getting on my soapbox for just a second, I've drawn parallels in the past, as I think probably many people have, of this recent romaine outbreak with the spinach outbreak of 2006. Approximately the same number of people ill, same number died. Challenging complexities around product tracking. Leafy Greens Agreement has done so much in that intervening period, yet here we are 12 years on from spinach in 2006, and we basically were in the same pickle as we were then. So I wouldn't be surprised if we didn't see a resurgence of push for traceability, but right now that's not I've not heard talk of that. It's just speculation. So they're more focused, I think, right now on chasing back real outbreaks than they are on anything else. But that'll be temporary, I'm sure, and they'll move back to FSMA-centric approaches to regulation pretty soon. So that's my thinking on that one, Jennifer.
Okay, thank you. Next question we have. Has FSMA impacted the rate of swabathons from FDA?
No, not that I've seen. Yeah, the swabathon is alive and well, and they're continuing to use them and to leverage them. So not at all. These are certainly not FSMA derived. They were happening before FSMA came along, and they continue to they continue to be pretty prevalent and to be highly impactful. They are being driven somewhat by concerns of outbreaks and the like. Again, it's a lot about what you hear on the street. But I was talking to somebody recently who makes ice cream, and it was actually part of a presentation I was giving, and I just sort of said to the audience, who's had a swabathon recently? A gentleman sitting in the front puts his hand up, and he said, I've had 3 in the last year. And it was like, really? And it turned out he was an ice cream manufacturer. He'd got through each one of them without them finding anything incriminating. But obviously that was driven by prior listeria challenges in ice cream. So I think the basic answer to this question is no, FSMA hasn't changed the swabathon trajectory or the frequency that I've seen, but swabathons are still yielding, I think, very good risk-based public health strategy from FDA's thinking. They are still seeing big value out of doing them. So I think we're going to continue to see the FDA doing these, and wouldn't be surprised if they get the resources that we'll see even more of them, because they do yield useful, leverageable data to the regulators. So swabathons are here to stay, I think.
Another somewhat related question, environmental monitoring. How is whole genome sequencing playing into FSMA enforcement and FDA actions?
Yeah, right. No, it is related to the swabathons. It's also related a little bit to the comment I made earlier about the use of whole genome sequencing for the FDA. I would suspect there's hardly anybody on this phone call who doesn't have some insight into whole genome sequencing. But my perspective of this is that this is becoming a very frequently used tool by FDA, and in terms of linking illnesses and linking situations with specific food products, or with specific facilities. So going back to the previous question that we had about the swabathons, if FDA finds a Salmonella or Listeria monocytogenes in your plant, even if it doesn't match anything in the current database, it goes into the database and it sits there until whenever. And we are definitely seeing this technology being leveraged, in which small number of cases are matching with through whole genome sequencing, which really is just a more sophisticated, higher fidelity approach than the old pulse field gel, which FDA and CDC still use. They still use pulse field gel, but they will sometimes take it to that next level of accuracy with whole genome. So half a dozen cases linked genetically, and based on the epidemiology, the questions they've asked the consumers: what did you eat? Where did you eat it? That is triggering FDA to go into plants and doing swabs and finding positives in plants that match those 5 or 6, 10 cases. And then before you know it, we're in a recall status for that particular food if it's still got shelf life. So it is being heavily used, and it's going to grow, and the database is growing hugely, the whole genome database, and it's global also. So it's information coming in from all over the world. I will say that some of the challenges around whole genome is related to how, when you have a match, what does that mean? And how much pushback is there with the FDA when the match isn't perfect? And it often isn't perfect. without getting overly technical, there's single nucleotide differences. Just a single nucleotide, an A, a C, a T, or a G, between strains, and as bacteria divide and multiply, then you sort of get some of these random minor changes. And how much is a natural variation over the course of time versus it's truly a different strain? And I think a very important message on whole genome is, number one, it is being used a lot by both regulators and public health officials at the state and Centers for Disease Control. And it is an indicant that there may be a link. And anybody who's on the call who's tangled up or tied up in any way with a whole genome connection, it's very important to sort of say, does the rest of the story fit? Did these individuals who got sick consume my product? Or if they didn't, what's the likelihood that they did? Does the timing fit between when you found the hit in my plant to when you're saying these people got sick? There is this sort of fear that just because the genetics link between a bug in your plant and a bug in a person, you're the responsible party for that, making that person sick. It is simply a starting point for an investigation, and it's very important to realize that will certainly trigger a regulator to show up, but by no means does it mean that your plant was responsible for the illness. And this sort of uniqueness notion is a very important one, and one that food companies struggle with. So if you do find yourself in one of these whole genome predicaments or questions, again, reach out. We're probably involved in one of these a week at the moment with different clients. So, that alone is evidence that this technology is being heavily leveraged and heavily used. And don't see it as a threat. It's just reality. But there's ways to handle it. So one other thought, Jennifer, on whole genome, and that is, I think companies are still struggling a little bit with, if we find Listeria or Salmonella in our plant, should we sequence it internally? And if we do, can we hold on to that data and protect it? There isn't a right and a wrong answer to that. It's a matter of what you feel is the right thing to do. But as we've talked about before on FSMA Fridays, what you do not want to get stuck with is being found to have a resident strain of a pathogen, either Listeria monocytogenes or Salmonella, in your plant, and you not know about it. What you must avoid at all costs is for the FDA to discover you have a resident strain. Then they will come down hard on you and start to push for some pretty hefty recalls. And that's still very much a dilemma, and there is no one-size-fits-all. But this is a very powerful tool, and used right and used correctly in your plant, it can do a lot in terms of sending the right message to FDA and keeping you out of trouble. But we could talk all morning about the whole genome sequencing, but we don't have all morning, so I better be quiet and hand it back to you.
Okay. We do have just a little time for maybe one more question. And here's one submitted by our live audience. Is random testing for pathogens by a third party still a good standard for small animal food companies, or should we look at pathogens testing in-house? Random testing that's a very complicated and interesting question, but random testing sort of, to me, implies that it's not statistically valid testing, and that may be a misinterpretation of the question, but assuming it's not statistically valid, it tells you absolutely nothing. And it even again, for those who know David, will know that I am not a big fan of finished product testing as a means to controlling risk. It is a way, if all else fails, that you can statistically sample, but that's expensive and it's complex, and you need to do a lot of samples to get up to sort of 95% confidence.
So I don't think random testing is a way forward under any circumstances. I'd far rather have other preventive controls. But if you are going to use it as a preventive control and you're under FSMA, then read that section of FSMA, because there's some pretty specific requirements in there about what you need to do and how you need to document it in the labs and the corrective actions and all that kind of thing. But, the final point on that is, if you are doing any sort of testing, zone 1 testing for environment or finished product testing, hold the product before you ship. And everybody who's probably groaning and saying, David, nobody does that today. And I'm going to fire right back and say, oh, yes, they do. We get regular calls from people who said, we tested. Do you have the product held? No, we let it go. It's still happening. So that's not direction the question was going, but that's my thinking on random testing. Is it's probably not worth it.
Okay, thanks. It looks like we're running up against our 30-minute mark, and although we do have a few more questions submitted by the audience, we'll get those answered for you offline after the event here. I would like to mention that between sessions, we do have a FSMA Fridays LinkedIn group, which is a good resource for continuing the conversation between sessions. And if you'd like to join, just request membership and we'll get you approved. Along the lines of continuing the conversation, Dr. Acheson and his team at the Acheson Group are experts on FSMA and can be a tremendous help in this area. You can check them out at achesongroup.com. And on the technology and tool side, we're able to complement what our partners over at TAG do to make the process of compliance more seamless, a lot faster, and more productive for your company. We've got some great solutions, and you can learn about them over at safetychain.com. Just in wrapping up, I'd like to tell you about a few more resources. We will be sending out a session recording, and we'll get that link and the deck out to everybody by early next week. I'd like to point out that we host monthly free educational webinar series called Beyond Compliance. We also host monthly demo days, and you can find all the details on our website at safetychain.com. And TAG distributes a very informative newsletter on current industry news and insights. You can check that out at achesongroup.com. Mark your calendars for next month's FSMA Fridays, which will be on August 24th. And with that, we want to thank all of you for joining us today. And Dr. Acheson, thank you so much for making the time to join us today. Hopefully we'll be able to talk you into coming back again very soon.
Sounds great. Appreciate your help, Jennifer, and thanks to everybody who joined us today. Great questions.
Thanks. Thank you, and thanks everybody for your participation today. See you next month, and have a great weekend.